Have you ever stopped to think that maybe the story of evolution, the one we all learn, might be missing some really big pieces? Today, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking a deep dive, looking into some surprising origins behind one of science's biggest ideas, and exploring some mind-bending scientific viewpoints that often get pushed aside. Yeah, our source material today gives us this fascinating look into Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and honestly, it challenges a lot of what we think we know. So our mission here is to get past that standard story, uncover some pretty astonishing stuff, and help you get genuinely clued in on this huge scientific concept. So let me ask you this right at the start. Have you ever wondered if the story of evolution, as we've been told it, is missing a few crucial chapters? Okay, let's jump right in. Darwin's academic background. It's surprising, right? Most people assume, rigorous scientist, STEM degree. But here's the twist. Darwin didn't actually have a science degree, not really. He got a Bachelor of Arts in Divinity from Cambridge, and the source we're looking at calls it more of a social rather than academic course. Suggests he was maybe more like a writer than a STEM guy.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how Origin of Species still became this, well, scientific Bible, even with that unconventional background. I mean, that core idea, survival of the fittest, natural selection, it just hit a nerve. It offered this powerful, seemingly logical way to understand all the life around us.
And here's where it gets really interesting. That key concept, survival of the fittest, it wasn't Darwin's idea to begin with. It actually came from Alfred Russel Wallace.
Exactly. And our source digs into Wallace's background, calling him pretty provocatively a mystic blogger, which really highlights this, alternative side to evolution's beginnings. It was this blend of scientific evidence and a more, let's say, mystical background. And because of that mix, you find strong supporting evidence, sure, but also these debunking counterexamples that really challenge the standard story. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why does mainstream science sometimes seem to, well, turn a blind eye to these debates? Our source hints they prefer digestible stories.
Oh, so are they just unaware? Or is it more like they're deliberately simplifying things, maybe even, as the source puts it, covering up something?
Let's unpack Darwin's background a bit more, because it's quite something. He was, as our source says, filthy rich. His grandfathers were these huge figures in the British Industrial Revolution, think like the biggest tech giants today rolled into one. Darwin was basically a third-generation rich kid, and his early school years, a struggle. Couldn't memorize poetry, apparently. Teachers, even his dad, thought he was below average. You probably know his father's famous line, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Ouch.
Yeah, so his father sends him off to Edinburgh University, which was a top medical school back then, like the Harvard Medical School of its day. But Darwin, he dropped out less than 2 years. Our source says he just couldn't persist for 3 minutes with the intense study.
Right. So Plan B, 1828, his father sends him to Cambridge. Math and theology this time.
Yeah.
But it sounds like Cambridge then was maybe less about hardcore academics and more about socializing and making friends in the right circles.
Oh, definitely. His lifestyle there was extravagant. We've got records from Christ's College from 2009 looking back showing he spent 636 times just on rent and basics over 3 years. Now, compare that to an army officer's salary back then, about £200 a year. He had personal staff for everything, polishing shoes, organizing his day, everything. And he started the Glutton Club, which, yeah, the source says they ate almost everything except humans. Apparently it didn't like owls too tough or some weird beetle.
So, okay, here's this liberal arts academic slacker, as the source kind of paints him, right? More interested in hunting, climbing, collecting specimens. How does he end up writing Origin of Species 20 years later and basically, opening up the biological meridians?
Well, you have to look at the time. The Industrial Revolution was booming. People wanted scientific explanations for everything. So Darwin's theory, you could argue, was maybe like today's influencers chasing hot topics. It provided these shocking arguments about where humans came from, fitting the mood perfectly. It sought to prove value, you could say.
It's interesting, Darwin himself, in Origin of Species, he sort of wonders aloud, did life's creator make every species individually? Or just a basic form that then evolved? And how did species get wisdom, as he put it?
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how some actual scientific evidence seems to clash with that idea of slow, steady, continuous evolution. Take the angiosperm enigma. Flowering plants, Fossils show they just sort of exploded onto the scene around 110 million years ago in the Cretaceous period.
Yeah.
Before that, plants didn't reproduce using flowers or fruit. It was a sudden massive change. Our source suggests, well, maybe the first forms and how they reproduced were actually designed. And maybe evolution isn't always slow. Maybe it can complete suddenly within a single individual. No long hybridization needed. It's still this famous biological puzzle. Nobody's really solved it.
Right. To get a feel for it, it's like, imagine you went to sleep tonight and tomorrow morning, because of some huge geological shift, suddenly there are, I don't know, X-Men walking around. Totally new, complex beings appearing almost overnight.
What?
That's kind of the scale of what happened with flowering plants.
Exactly. And that really goes against what we usually learn in school, right? About evolution being all about slow, stable genes changing over eons, which brings up that big question again. Why don't we hear more about these controversial bits? Is the standard evolution story maybe being used, maybe unintentionally, to kind of cover up these more mystical possibilities that the evidence seems to point towards?
Okay, so let's pivot now. Alfred Russel Wallace, we mentioned him, the guy who actually came up with survival of the fittest first. His background, totally different from Darwin's. Polar opposite, really. Wallace's father was described as idle, didn't work much. Result, extreme poverty. Wallace had 9 siblings. 3 died young because they couldn't afford medical care. Just tragic.
But despite all that, Wallace was this incredible self-taught mind. I mean, by age 6 or 7, he'd supposedly memorized Shakespeare, loved philosophy, science, adventure stories. At just 14, he wrote something pretty profound. Life is a journey, and a journey is a series of uneasy adventures. That really captures his spirit.
And those early struggles, plus his exposure to Robert Owen's ideas, humanism, society, looking after the poor, they shaped his version of natural selection. For Wallace, it wasn't just dog eat dog. His concept leaves room for coexistence, even while there's competition. So he rooted evolution in social theory too, which might be why it felt so, well, naturally acceptable to many people.
Then personal tragedy struck again. His brother died, then his father. This led him to try hypnosis therapy. And experiencing that sense of conscious control over his own body's functions, it apparently made him obsessed with organisms. It added this mysterious veil to his life, as the source puts it.
And then his friend, Henry Walter Bates, who was a rich, second-generation guy, a specimen collector, suggested Wallace go to South America. The idea was, find some meaning in the primitive jungle, collect specimens. And it was out there that Wallace really started cooking up these revolutionary ideas.
And his take on natural selection had 2 really crucial points that differ from how it's often taught. First, the Wallace line. He realized these huge geographical barriers, like deep ocean trenches, dictate where species live. That made him the father of biogeography. Second, and this is huge, environmental primacy. Wallace believed the environment was way more important in driving evolution than just genetic links. He thought the direction of mutation was basically random, uncertain. It's the environment that decides which genes make the cut, which ones survive.
Okay, so let's use that classic giraffe example. Wallace isn't saying giraffes slowly stretch their necks over generations to reach leaves. No, his idea was more like some early giraffes just happened to be born with longer necks. Random variation. Then, boom, disaster hits the grasslands, maybe a drought. Low-lying food disappears. The short-necked giraffes, they die out. Only the ones already having longer necks survive and pass on those genes.
Exactly. The environment does the selecting from what's available. And if the environment is the absolute key, Wallace argued, then you eventually have to tackle the origin of consciousness or spirit. You can't avoid it. Now, the standard view, the sort of machine theory, often sees consciousness as just something that emerges when you get a complex enough brain, enough neural networks, like AI, right? More power, more logic, boom, intelligence. But Wallace, he threw a wrench in that. If you add the environment into that whole matter-spirit equation, things get, well, metaphysical. He suggested maybe complex brains are just carriers. Carriers for what? For environmental spirit or consciousness. Our source even compares it to Taoist ideas of soul possession. Wallace himself wrote, quite directly, the development of the brain can be attributed to the guidance of a spiritual intelligence. Pretty radical stuff.
Wow. So what did Darwin think of that? Must have been quite a shock. Well, we have a letter. Darwin to Wallace, March 27, 1869. He wrote, and you can almost hear the worry, I hope you have not murdered our child, evolution, completely.
Huh. Yeah, you can see why Darwin might be worried, but there are arguments that support Wallace's line of thinking, things that make you go, like the human brain. It runs on, 20 watts, like a dim light bulb. Yet it does things no supercomputer can, and way more efficiently. How? And why? Why did life go from simple single cells to us, complex humans working crazy hours? Why not just stay as, like, green algae, happily photosynthesizing?
Right. What kind of environment, what pressure could make simple organisms band together to become us? Or, maybe more to the point, who or what wanted intelligent creatures like humans to show up on this planet? These are the kinds of questions Wallace's ideas force you to ask. Okay, let's shift again slightly. Let's talk about human ancestry, specifically Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, which is always presented as, Exhibit A for human evolution. But our source questions this, pointing out that dating these finds is actually quite primitive, scientifically speaking. And it relies a lot on how the discoverer interprets things initially.
Yeah, the method used, the morphological one, basically classifying based on shape and form, our source calls it not rigorous. Lucy's bones, for instance, seem like a mix. Part ape, hands and shoulders, good for climbing. Part human lower body, suited for walking upright. Almost like the source uses the term mermaid, a hybrid. But this interpretation kind of starts with the assumption that humans must have evolved directly from creatures like Lucy.
But what if that assumption is wrong? What if maybe early humans just lived alongside these ancient ape-like species? We know for a fact that early modern humans coexisted and even interbred with Neanderthals, right?
Absolutely. The genetic proof is solid. Modern Europeans carry, 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. And this raises that really tricky biological question. How can different species interbreed? Isn't reproductive isolation, the inability to produce fertile offspring, supposed to be like rule number one? Our source mentions 3 main theories people throw around. 1, maybe they were actually the same species. 2, maybe they just hadn't been separate species for long enough for isolation to be complete. Or 3, this kind of weird idea of a transitional phase where genes could still cross over even if the direct offspring weren't fertile. It's complex, and there's more evidence. Think about Sherpas and Tibetans, how well they handle low oxygen. That adaptation. It comes from DNA traced back to Denisovans, another ancient human relative, maybe 100,000 years old. Our DNA is like a patchwork quilt of these ancient fragments.
Okay, now this is where the source kind of pushes things, maybe into more mystical territory, building on this idea of latent genes. It brings up Nazi Germany's Lebensborn project, this disturbing attempt to somehow breed or restore a supposed ancient Atlantis race. And then there's the werewolf legend from World War II. Stories of this secret Nazi unit, supposedly superhuman, incredible strength, healing, senses, terrifying Allied soldiers in night raids.
Yeah, it's unsettling stuff, but the source connects it conceptually to later things like post-war super soldier programs, think DARPA projects, and it links to this idea of ghost DNA, fragments in our genes that are silent now, inactive, because maybe the current environment doesn't switch them on, which leads to the really big question. If these genes could be activated, what abilities might they unlock? Things we can't even imagine, and how would that even happen?
So it really makes you think. If the lines between species were blurry 50,000 years ago with Neanderthals, what about way, way further back?
Yeah.
Could those ancient myths, bird-headed people or human-faced beasts, could they represent some kind of real interbreeding in the distant past? Could their strange abilities be dormant inside us?
And if you follow that thought, if life goes in cycles with big disasters wiping the slate clean and new forms emerging, does that mean some kind of latent, maybe even divine powers might reappear if humanity faces, say, extinction? Could that push us into a whole new era? It's a wild thought.
It really is, and it brings us back to this idea.
Yeah.
Maybe humans aren't the end point. Maybe we're a transitional state, or even, like the source suggests, hybrids. Could we be the evolutionary equivalent of mules or ligers, a crossbreed of different ancient human species?
Well, think about AI for a second. If a truly conscious AI emerges, will it automatically wipe us out? Maybe not. Look at cockroaches. 300 million years they've been around. Ants, 100 million years. They survive because they're weak, adaptable, not because they're dominant powerhouses. Compare that to the powerful species Neanderthals, saber-toothed tigers, maybe those mythical Atlanteans. Their time on Earth was much shorter. So the source raises this really provocative point. Maybe humans survive not because we're strong, but precisely because we're weak in many ways. We don't have claws or super strength or amazing healing. We can't photosynthesize. We're not great pack hunters like wolves or fighters like tigers. Yet here we are. So if humans are transitional, maybe those ancient, too strong species had genetic problems. Maybe they struggled to reproduce easily. Maybe hybridization, mixing genes, was the only way forward. And maybe humans, with our particular set of traits, just happened to be the most suitable match for that mixing.
Which loops us right back to that initial secret, doesn't it? Why the strong academic insistence that we came directly from ancient apes, and why the tendency to overlook that maybe evolution is just one part of a much bigger life story. Our source ties it to the genes we carry, and then it asks that really pointed question. If groups in the past tried to restore an Atlantis race, what if someone today wanted to restore other ancient lines, like the Chiyu or Yangwan races mentioned? Is that potential? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's unsettling to consider. Look, we know today's deep dive went into some pretty wild territory, but I think the main takeaway is this. This world, our own biology, it might be far more complex, maybe even more mystical than we usually allow ourselves to think. I mean, think about things people can actually do. There are documented cases, right? The 73-year-old lifting a car with his head, Daniel Kish, blind, using echolocation like a bat, Veronica Sider, reportedly seeing things clearly over a mile away. Aren't these real-life abilities almost more incredible, more mystical than some of the speculations we've talked about?
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, something to mull over after we finish. If humans are some kind of transitional form heading towards something else, what do you think our ultimate evolutionary form might actually be? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive today.